It's Wednesday, March 4th, or day 2 of what's going to be a huge severe weather event, which is going to last all the way through Friday this week. We might even see some severe weather back down here in the southern plains on Saturday, but this is what we've got going for us. We have a long, skinny risk, which spans all the way from San Antonio all the way up to around Louisville and Indiana. This is, of course, going to come with a slight risk, and the main risk with this is going to be damaging winds and hail. I think probably what we're mostly going to see is damaging winds, but just because you're in this yellow doesn't mean you're actually going to see damaging winds. It looks like we're going to have three main clusters of activity, one near the DFW metro, one near northern Arkansas, southern Missouri, and then one up here near St. Louis that's going to track towards Louisville and Indianapolis. And right there, I didn't really mention the tornado threat because it's going to be pretty conditional. I definitely think we will see a couple of tornadoes today. It's just there's not really an environment that I look at and I say that there's definitely going to be a bunch of tornadoes right here. So this system is actually going to start with kind of this morning's convection in part of northern Oklahoma. This is going to be some elevated stuff, which really only had a risk of bringing some hail. But as we move east and north, we're actually going to see a re-intensification later in the afternoon when this is just around the St. Louis, Louisville, and then tracking towards Indianapolis area. We're going to have kind of a weak low pressure system backing this right along our front. This also isn't going to be a very strong front than our warm front up here. So already this is going to be one of the more primed areas for some severe weather. And immediately we're going to see a pretty organized storm cluster come through. The main thing with this is going to be damaging winds, hail not so much because it's linear, but the parameters, which I'll show you later, are actually going to be very conducive for that. And definitely I think a tornado or two is going to be possible with that. Those threats are likely going to peak probably in the mid-afternoon today, and this won't really lose steam until it goes just east of the Indianapolis metro a little bit after sunset. Now, once that cluster is done, we're actually going to see our two other main clusters, the one in northern Arkansas, southern Missouri, kind of come together, then the one near the DFW metroplex. First and foremost, this one near northern Arkansas in southern Missouri, I think, is probably the storm cluster which has the chance of producing all hazards today. That's going to be tornadoes, hail, and damaging winds. I think with the tornadoes, once again, it's not really a slam dunk forecast, but if there was going to be somewhere to do it, it's definitely going to be this cluster. Damaging winds are probably also going to be pretty strong here because our shear is also going to be quite good. Moving down to the DFW metroplex, there's one missing ingredient, and that's going to be bulk shear. When I show you the soundings, and you'll definitely see how much that's going to impact everything. Other than that, pretty solid environment down here, though. But these storms are really going to rely on that low-level jet and a lot of positive storm mergers to really produce a solid threat with hail and damaging winds. Definitely think we will see some severe warned storms down here, though it's just kind of a hit or miss with that because we're really relying on some good storm mergers, then a couple of other ingredients to come together. And that's going to be pretty much it for our convective allowing models. As we go into the night, things definitely start to get a little bit more messy and disorganized, and it mostly just turns into a lot of rain. Shouldn't really be a huge flooding threat with this, but definitely be on the lookout for any flood warnings. And then this is going to be what our 500 millibar jet stream is doing today. We're going to see a couple of things which definitely makes sense. One thing, we're not really seeing a whole lot of synoptic backing of our storm cluster that's going to be up near St. Louis. Won't really need it as much because it's going to be part of a storm cluster from this morning, which is going to move up and then get in front of our front and then have that ability to re-intensify closer to that warm front in a fairly weak low pressure system. Now for our other areas, one is going to be down here in northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. This synoptic forcing in just general environment is actually going to play a big role in why it's going to be strong. If we use our straight jet theory right here, we're going to see that all of this is going to be in the right lower quadrant, and that's going to be really good for these storms to really blossom. And we'll also see that it's no coincidence that it kind of coincides around 0Z or closer to the late afternoon and sunset when we're really expecting these storms to get their act together. Then we also have a little bit more of a short wave down here. Not sure if this is kind of contamination or not, but if this is true, if there is a little bit of a kink down near DFW, maybe that would help solve that problem with that lack of deep layer shear. And now we're going to move into our deep analysis through our weather soundings. This is looking at the first cluster up near St. Louis and Indianapolis, and immediately our thermodynamics aren't going to be that bad at all. Definitely wish it would be a little bit hotter. It is sub 70-degree temperatures, which isn't ideal for severe weather, but we're also getting above 2000 Cape. So at the same time, that's not really going to matter as much. We see high 60s dew points, and we also see quite a bit of Cape, maybe some dry air aloft. This could help maybe to increase that threat of some damaging winds as well. Other stuff to note is that our 3 Cape is going to be extraordinarily high at 150. This kind of makes sense because we normally see this value reach its highest levels around where that cold front and warm front and that low pressure system are going to meet. Something to note about these storms is that their deep layer shear is going to be around 50 knots. That's going to be really solid for them sustaining, and is one of the reasons why hail might even be possible despite having a really linear storm mode. Also, in the lower levels in the first kilometer, we're seeing pretty solid shear parameters around 100 SRH and 23 knots of shear. However, our effective inflow, which is really the total inflow going into the storm, is pretty bad actually. Only 41 SRH and 11 knots of shear. And that becomes pretty evident when you look at our photograph up here. It's only taking stuff from this sliver right here. Overall, we see pretty solid curvature, but it's actually in the upper levels. So definitely not impossible for a tornado to come out of here because the first kilometer shear parameters aren't that bad. We have really high levels of 3 Cape. These storms are going to be surface based, and we just generally have a pretty moist, unstable environment. However, our shear parameters are going to be the one thing that could kind of hinder it back. Definitely think we are going to see a couple of tornadoes out of this. They're just not going to be that strong. But now we're going to move down to that storm cluster in northern Arkansas and southern Missouri. Once again, thermos aren't going to be that bad. Not great either, kind of mirroring what we saw actually up near the St. Louis and Indianapolis storm cluster. Not bad at all. However, down here we're seeing a little bit less instability, but the main thing that's going to really save the day here is going to be these essentially pretty perfect shear parameters. We're seeing above 40 knots of deep layer shear, and then we're seeing 250 SRH and around 30 knots of shear in the inflow of our storm. Looking at our photograph, it immediately makes sense. We see a really favorable curve here pretty much in all levels. And because these storms are going to be surface based, we also see some directional shear with our wind speeds getting higher as we go higher up in the atmosphere. Definitely think this is going to be the environment that's going to have the highest possibility of producing tornadoes today, along with damaging winds and hail, and kind of why that Indianapolis storm cluster is really going to have a higher chance of producing hail and damaging winds rather than tornadoes, because it's kind of just lacking those really solid shear parameters. And then this is going to be the final storm cluster that we're looking at. This is going to be the DFW Metroplex, and immediately we're noticing that it's going to be really favorably unstable here around 2,750 Cape, and then also nearing 143 Cape. So a really unstable environment. Actually, we also are nearing around 70-degree dew points, and it's going to be 75 degrees. So thermos definitely aren't that bad at all either. We are seeing a big plume of Cape up here in the deeper levels, which would normally spell hail, but the main crux for these storms is going to be that we're sub 25 knots of deep layer shear. To see supercells, we'd like that number to be closer to 30 knots. So that's definitely not going to be there, and it's going to be the main hindrance for this, which is actually kind of crazy. This is almost saving the DFW Metroplex, because if we look at our lower level shear parameters, we're seeing pretty solid stuff here also. In the effective inflow, we have around 100 SRH and nearing 20 knots of low level shear. Then also when these storms kind of get into that low level jet mode as we get closer to sunset, those parameters will only increase, not the deep layer shear though. I mean, even in our holograph, we have a nice little curve, then a elongation out, which normally spells trouble. But because our deep layer shear is going to be pretty bad, it looks like these storms really aren't going to be able to sustain or spin fast enough to really get that strong. And they're going to rely along kind of clustering along our front in some really positive storm mergers to produce those strongest hazards, I believe. Now, is a tornado impossible down here? Definitely not. We do have pretty solid shear parameters in the first kilometer or just the general lowest levels of the atmosphere. I think the main thing, though, is that it's going to kind of be a hit or miss, but these storms are definitely going to be something to watch as we go into the late afternoon and evening hours.